On
neighbors
her
never
son's
change their
wedding day,
stripes, dear, and
Margaret
neither will
smiled
you. You'll never be good
sweetly
enough
and
for my
whispered to his
son.
new
Mark my
wife,
word.
"You'll never be good enough for my family." But she had no idea she'd just met her match. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another emotional story that touches the heart. The spring air in Charleston, South Carolina carried the scent of magnolias and freshly cut grass. The white-columned Thompson estate gleamed proudly under the afternoon sun, an image of southern perfection. Inside, however, perfection came with sharp edges. Margaret Thompson, 67, stood before a gilded mirror adjusting the pearl necklace that once belonged to her grandmother. Everything about her, the neatly pinned silver hair, the pressed lavender dress, the posture straight as a ruler, spoke of discipline and tradition. She'd built her reputation in Charleston's old circles, not through wealth alone, but through control. And now her only son was about to ruin it all. She glanced toward the French windows where the wedding guests mingled on the lawn. The band played soft jazz, waiters carried trays of champagne, and laughter floated on the breeze. But all Margaret saw was her son, Ethan, tall, handsome, and hopelessly in love with her. Grace Miller, the girl from Savannah, a nurse, a woman with no family name, no trust fund, no sense of refinement, at least not by Margaret's standards. Grace Miller, Margaret muttered to herself, the name tasting bitter. What kind of woman marries up this fast? As if summoned by the thought, the young bride walked into view. Grace wore a simple lace gown, nothing extravagant, but she carried herself with quiet poise. Her long brown hair framed a face that glowed with kindness more than glamour. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't loud, but her presence drew eyes anyway. Something in her softness that made people lean closer. When Ethan caught sight of her, his smile could have lit up the entire estate. Margaret's chest tightened. He had never smiled like that, not even for her. At the reception, Margaret held court at her table, surrounded by old Charleston friends, the type who always wore pearls and spoke in compliments that sliced like blades. "Well," said Helen Braddock, sipping her champagne, "she's different. Sweet, I suppose." "Sweet," Margaret repeated, smiling thinly. "Yes, but sweetness doesn't keep a home. It spoils." They all laughed quietly, the way women laugh when cruelty is considered culture. But their laughter faded when Grace approached carrying a tray of cupcakes. "Mrs. Thompson," she said warmly, "I wanted to bring you one of the lemon ones. I remembered you said they were your favorite." "You baked these?" Margaret blanked. "I did," Grace said, smiling genuinely. "It's an old recipe from my grandmother." Margaret looked at the delicate frosting, perfect swirls topped with fresh zest. She wanted to find a flaw, a reason to turn away, but instead she just said, "How thoughtful." Then added under her breath, "I suppose store-bought wasn't an option." Grace didn't flinch. She simply said, "No, ma'am. I believe family deserves effort." Something in her tone, calm, confident, kind without being weak, made Margaret's next insult stick in her throat. Later that evening, when the music slowed and the candles glowed soft, Margaret found Ethan near the dance floor. "Son," she began, her voice smooth but firm, "we need to talk. If this is about Grace, it is. You're rushing into something you don't understand. You come from generations of Thompsons, Ethan. Your father worked his whole life to what, Mother? Build a life that looks good from the outside but feels hollow on the inside?" Margaret stiffened. "Don't you dare." "Grace makes me happy," Ethan said quietly. "She's real. She doesn't care about my money or the family name. She just cares." His tone was final, his eyes steady, and it frightened her more than she'd admit. He wasn't her little boy anymore. He was a man standing on his own ground. "Fine," she said coldly, "but don't come crying when you realize you've made a mistake." Then, as Grace approached to take Ethan's hand for their dance, Margaret smiled sweetly and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "You'll never be good enough for this family." Grace met her eyes without a flicker of anger. "That's all right, Mrs. Thompson," she said softly. "I didn't marry the family. I married the man." And then she walked away. Gracefully, without looking back. Margaret stood frozen, her own words hanging in the humid air like smoke. That night, as guests departed and laughter faded into the cicada song outside, Margaret sat alone on the porch, sipping sweet tea gone bitter in the glass. She replayed Grace's words again and again. They hadn't been disrespectful, just true, and that truth burned worse than any insult could. From inside, she could hear Ethan and Grace laughing, carefree, young, happy. And for the first time in years, Margaret Thompson felt something she'd long buried under pride and power. Fear. Because deep down, she knew this young woman wasn't just kind, she was strong. And Margaret had just picked a fight she might not win. If your mother-in-law insulted you on your wedding day, would you fight back or stay calm like Grace did? Be honest, what would you do?
For a while after the wedding, things stayed civil, at least on the surface. Every Sunday afternoon, Ethan and Grace made the hour-long drive from their cozy townhouse in downtown Charleston to the Thompson estate, where Margaret hosted her weekly family luncheons. To most, these gatherings were a picture of Southern charm, silver cutlery, fine china, and Margaret at the head of the table, always smiling. But to Grace, they felt like walking through a minefield dressed in Sunday lace. Every word had weight. Every compliment came with a sting. "Grace, dear," Margaret said sweetly one afternoon, passing the green beans, "I couldn't help but notice your dress. It's lovely. You bought it in town?" "Yes, ma'am, at a small boutique near the hospital." "How wonderful," Margaret said, lifting her wineglass. "It's so refreshing to see a young woman not waste her husband's money on expensive clothes." The table chuckled, everyone except Ethan. Grace only smiled again, her calm unbroken. "Well," she said softly, "when you earn your own money, you spend it wisely." A hush fell. Margaret's smile stiffened. Ethan nearly choked on his water, trying not to laugh. After lunch, while Ethan helped carry dishes, Margaret cornered Grace in the kitchen. "Tell me something," she began, her voice smooth as honey but sharp beneath. "Do you plan to keep working after you have children?" Grace glanced up from the sink. "Yes, ma'am. Nursing is a calling for me. I'd like to continue." Her lips pursed. "You'll regret that. A husband's respect doesn't grow from a wife who leaves her home to chase a paycheck." Grace dried her hands, turning slowly to meet her eyes. "With all due respect, Mrs. Thompson, a husband's respect grows from a wife who never loses herself." For the first time, Margaret found herself speechless. From then on, it became a quiet war, not of shouting or scandal, but of polite battles hidden under Southern manners. Margaret would accidentally forget to invite Grace to social events. She'd drop subtle comments to Ethan, little seeds of doubt meant to stir friction. "You know, dear, I saw Grace's car outside the hospital quite late again. Are you sure she's not overworking herself? She looks tired lately. Maybe she's not cut out for this lifestyle. A good wife knows when to put her marriage first." But to her surprise, Ethan didn't bite. "Mom," he said one evening after dinner, his voice firm, "Grace is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I love her, and she makes me proud every day." She froze, her son's tone unfamiliar. There was no pleading, no hesitation, just quiet conviction. She forced a smile. "Of course, dear. I'm only concerned." But as she watched him leave, she felt it. A chill. Her control was slipping. Weeks passed, and Grace's patience never faltered. She kept visiting, she brought fresh-baked bread, offered help with errands, even called to check on Margaret's health. It infuriated her. No matter how she poked, Grace refused to break. She responded to cruelty with composure, to insult with kindness. And that kind of strength, the quiet, unshakable kind, unsettled Margaret more than defiance ever could. One Saturday, Ethan invited his mother to dinner at their house. Margaret arrived precisely on time, carrying a basket of hydrangeas and wearing her usual polished smile. The house was modest but warm, walls lined with family photos, soft jazz was playing in the background. It smelled of rosemary and baked chicken. Grace greeted her warmly. "Welcome, Mrs. Thompson. I made your favorite, lemon chicken." Margaret smiled, feigning delight. How thoughtful. But as they sat down, Margaret began her favorite game, subtle sabotage. "So, Grace, I ran into Helen Braddock yesterday. She mentioned her daughter just got promoted at the hospital. Nurse supervisor, I believe. Do you work with her?" "Yes, I do. Jenna's wonderful." "She must be, to have earned such a position." Margaret sipped her wine. Ethan glanced between them, sensing the tension. "Grace was offered that job too, actually," he said proudly. "She turned it down to focus on the children's wing, said that's where her heart is." Margaret froze. For a moment, she had no weapon left. Grace looked at her gently. "Titles don't always measure impact, Mrs. Thompson. Sometimes making a difference means staying where you're needed most." Margaret swallowed hard. Something about the way Grace said it, sincere, unthreatening, made her feel small. Later that evening, after Margaret left, she sat in her car parked at the end of the driveway, hands gripping the steering wheel. For years, she'd prided herself on being the strongest woman in the room, polished, respected, untouchable. But this young woman, this nurse from Savannah, had managed to beat her at her own game without raising her voice once. And for the first time, Margaret Thompson realized she wasn't dealing with just a sweet, naive bride. She was facing a woman who carried grace as her armor, and there was no weapon strong enough to pierce that. That night, Grace and Ethan curled up on the couch, watching old movies and laughing softly. "She's trying, Ethan," Grace said quietly. "I know she doesn't see it yet, but I don't hate her." He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "That's what makes you different." Grace's eyes glimmered as she whispered, "One day she'll understand." Outside, the rain began to fall. Soft, steady, cleansing. And somewhere across town, Margaret sat by her bedroom window, staring into the storm, wondering why she suddenly felt so tired.
The storm rolled in on a Tuesday. Charleston's skies turned gray, and thunder grumbled in the distance, the kind of weather that made the old bones ache and memories stir. For Margaret Thompson, the day began like any other. She had her tea exactly at 7, read the Post and Courier, and called the garden service to complain about the hydrangeas. But by noon, something in her chest felt wrong. A sharp pain shot down her arm, and the teacup slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. When she woke again, everything was white. Blinding lights, antiseptic air, and the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. "Mrs. Thompson, you're in Charleston Medical. You've had a mild heart attack." Her doctor's voice was calm, but the words hit like bricks. Heart attack? Her? She had always prided herself on control, diet, health, reputation. She wasn't supposed to break. The door opened softly. Margaret turned her head, expecting Ethan. It wasn't him. It was Grace. Still wearing scrubs, hair tied back, eyes full of quiet concern. "Mrs. Thompson, don't try to move. You're safe." Margaret's throat tightened. "Where's Ethan?" "He's on a work trip in Atlanta. He's catching the next flight back. I'm here with you till then." Margaret blinked. "You don't have to." Grace shook her head. "I want to." In the storm was worsening. Rain hammered the hospital windows, while Grace sat quietly by Margaret's bedside, knitting a small baby blanket for one of her pediatric patients. Margaret watched her, too proud to admit how comforted she felt by the sound of those needles clicking softly in the dark. Finally, she spoke. "You could have gone home." Grace smiled without looking up. "And missed the chance to make sure my favorite mother-in-law behaves herself? Never." Margaret actually chuckled, just a small sound, but real. It startled her. The following days blurred into routine. Grace came every morning before her shift, checked Margaret's vitals, fluffed her pillows, and made sure the nurses followed the right diet plan. She brought home-cooked soup when the hospital food proved unbearable. Even Margaret's old bridge friends only visited once. They stayed 10 minutes, whispered condolences, and laughed. Grace stayed, and that unnerved her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the clouds, Margaret broke the silence. "You really don't have to keep coming, Grace." Grace looked up from her chart. "I know." "Then why do you?" Grace hesitated, her voice soft. "Because I know what it feels like to face the world alone. And because I made a promise, to Ethan and to myself, to love his family like my own." Margaret swallowed hard. "Even when they don't deserve it?" Grace smiled faintly. "Especially then." Later that night, as Grace tidied the tray table, a photo slipped out of Margaret's purse, a small worn picture of a young man in uniform. Grace picked it up carefully. "Your husband?" Margaret's gaze softened, her walls cracking a little. "Yes, George. He passed away 22 years ago." Grace studied the photo, then looked up. "You must have loved him very much." Margaret's lips trembled. "He was everything good in me. When he died, I just tried to hold on to whatever was left. Maybe I held too tight." Grace nodded gently, the understanding in her eyes piercing deeper than any lecture could. "You were scared of losing your son, too." Margaret blinked back tears. "How did you—" Grace smiled sadly. "It's what people do when they've loved deeply and lost once. They try to control everything so it can't happen again." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with truth. Margaret looked away, her voice breaking. "You're too kind, Grace, and I've been nothing but cruel." Grace took her hand. "You were hurt, and hurt people hurt people." Margaret's tears finally fell, slow and quiet. "I thought if I could keep Ethan's life perfect, I'd never feel that pain again. I didn't realize I was becoming the storm I feared." For the first time, Grace saw not the proud, cold matriarch, but a woman who had built her strength on fear, not malice. As the night deepened, Grace helped her adjust her blankets and whispered, "You're not alone anymore, Mrs. Thompson. You've got family who actually wants to love you, if you'll let them." Margaret nodded weakly, her lips trembling. "Call me Margaret, dear, please." Grace smiled, blinking back her own tears. "All right, Margaret." Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The thunder faded into distant murmurings, and the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. Margaret fell asleep with Grace still sitting beside her, the same woman she once tried to chase away, now guarding her like a daughter. If someone who hurt you deeply ended up needing your care, would you forgive or protect your heart and walk away? Tell me in the comments below, what would you do if you were Grace?
The spring sunlight filtered gently through the curtains of Margaret's living room weeks later, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floor. Her recovery had been steady, slower than she liked, but steady. And though she'd never say it aloud, the days now felt quieter. Too quiet. Ethan had returned to work, and her circle of friends had all but disappeared once her health became inconvenient. The only constant visitor was the same woman she once called unsuitable, Grace. Every morning, Grace arrived with groceries, flowers, and that same calm smile. She cooked, cleaned, and even helped Margaret walk around the garden for light exercise. "Careful now," Grace said one afternoon as Margaret stumbled slightly. "I can manage," Margaret huffed, gripping the rail of the porch. Grace smiled knowingly. "I don't doubt it, Margaret. I just don't want your pride to beat your balance." Margaret shot her a look, but then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed freely in months. As days turned to weeks, Margaret began to see. She noticed how Grace's laughter filled the house with warmth that had been missing for years. She saw the tenderness with which Grace cared not only for her, but for Ethan. How she left encouraging notes in his lunch bag, how she remembered small details about everyone around her. It baffled her. Grace had no pedigree, no social connections, no formal elegance, and yet people gravitated toward her as if she were born to belong. And Margaret, for all her refinement, realized she'd spent years building a castle no one wanted to visit. One evening, as Grace prepared tea, Margaret found herself speaking without plan. "My husband George used to drink tea with lemon, said it reminded him of summers on the coast." Grace smiled softly. "Ethan told me you two met at a fundraiser." Margaret nodded, eyes distant. "He made me laugh. I wasn't used to that. Laughter. My parents were strict, always talking about image, reputation, expectations. I suppose I became them." Grace placed a cup beside her. "Then maybe it's time to become you again." Margaret blinked. "And who is that?" Grace smiled faintly. "A woman who still has time to make new memories, not just guard old ones." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in her study, surrounded by family photos, the young, happy faces of people who had long drifted away. Her eyes fell on one particular frame, a picture of Ethan at 10, holding a fishing rod beside his father. Margaret remembered that day, how George had begged her to come along and how she had refused because of an upcoming charity brunch. The brunch was long forgotten, but that smile on Ethan's face, she'd never seen it again. Her chest tightened. For years, she'd blamed others for the distance, but now she saw the truth. She had built the walls herself. The next morning, Margaret asked Grace to join her for lunch, not at the estate, but at a local diner by the harbor. When Grace arrived, she found Margaret already seated by the window, watching the waves. There was something softer about her that day. Her pearls replaced by a simple gold chain, her posture relaxed. "I used to think people like me didn't belong in places like this," Margaret said, stirring her coffee. "But I realize now that was pride talking. Everyone belongs where there's kindness." Grace smiled. "You're learning fast." Margaret chuckled. "Well, I have a good teacher." They ate quietly for a while, watching a young family laugh over pancakes at the next table. Grace noticed Margaret's expression. Wistful, almost aching. "You miss him, don't you?" Grace asked gently. Margaret nodded. "Every day. I see George and Ethan sometimes, the way he smiles when he's happy. And I suppose I see him in you, too." Grace blinked, surprised. "In me?" "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "George always believed kindness was strength. I used to think he was naive. But you live it. You've shown me that grace, your name, fittingly, isn't weakness, it's power." Grace's eyes shimmered. "We all need a little grace, Margaret, even when we think we don't deserve it." From that day, their relationship began to change. Grace no longer tiptoed around her mother-in-law. She teased her gently, shared stories from the hospital, and even helped her use the new tablet Ethan had bought her. And Margaret, she listened. She laughed. She began to ask about Grace's patience, her childhood, her dreams. For the first time in her life, she was learning to connect, not control. Weeks later, Grace stopped by with exciting news. She'd been nominated for a hospital humanitarian award. Margaret beamed with genuine pride. "I'm coming to that ceremony, and don't you dare try to stop me." Grace laughed. "I wouldn't dream of it." As Grace laughed, Margaret called out, "Grace?" "Yes." "Thank you," Margaret said softly, "for not giving up on me." Grace smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the soul. Family's worth fighting for, Margaret, even when it's complicated. That night, Margaret wrote in her late husband's old journal, something she hadn't done in over 20 years. "George, if you're watching, you'll be glad to know our son married a woman with your heart. She's teaching me things I thought I already knew, about love, forgiveness, and what really matters. I wish you could meet her properly. You'd adore her." When she closed the book, she realized she was crying. But the tears weren't bitter this time. They were cleansing. Do you believe some people only learn compassion after life humbles them, or can anyone choose to change before it's too late? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to know what you believe.
Thanksgiving came early that year in Charleston. The air was crisp, the trees painted in burnt gold and amber. Margaret stood in her kitchen, a soft aroma of cinnamon and roasted turkey filling the air. She hadn't cooked a holiday meal in years, not since George passed, but today she wanted to. She needed to. This time, it wasn't about presentation or perfection. It was about people. Grace had spent the morning helping her set the table, while Ethan fetched his favorite pumpkin pie from the bakery. The house, once cold and quiet, now hummed with laughter, music, and life. Margaret watched Grace work, her hands moving gracefully as she arranged candles on the dining table. She had learned every crevice of this home over the past months, not as a visitor, but as family. "I hope I'm not overstepping," Grace said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "I swapped the crystal vases for something simpler. Fresh magnolias felt more real." Margaret smiled. "They're perfect. I think I've had enough of pretending everything has to shine." Grace turned, touched. "That's quite a confession, Mrs. Tom—" Margaret raised a brow. Grace grinned. "Margaret, then." By 5 o'clock, the table was full. Ethan's laughter filled the air as he carved the turkey, and even the old grandfather clock seemed to tick more cheerfully than usual. Margaret looked around at her family, not just the one that she had raised, but the one that she had finally learned to let in. Everyone Before we eat, I'd like to say something." The chatter died down. Grace looked up from her plate, sensing something heavy in Margaret's tone. "I used to think strength meant control, that love was something you guarded, not given freely. When George died, I built a wall around my heart so high that even my own son couldn't climb it. And when Grace came into our lives, I saw her as a threat instead of a blessing." Grace's eyes glistened, but she stayed silent, listening. Margaret continued, her voice breaking. "I was cruel, jealous, and blind. I wanted to protect Ethan, but all I did was hurt him. And you, Grace. And yet, you never stopped showing me kindness. You gave me the one thing I didn't deserve." She turned toward her daughter-in-law. "Grace, you've taught me that real strength doesn't come from power or pride. It comes from forgiveness, from love that doesn't demand, but simply is." Tears slid down Grace's cheeks. Ethan took her hand, his own eyes wet. "Mom," he whispered, "you have no idea what this means." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I do, darling. That's why I'm saying it. I need to." She reached across the table, taking Grace's hand in hers. "I once said you'd never be good enough for this family, but now I see you're the reason it still exists." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fireplace. Then, Grace squeezed her hand. "I forgave you long ago, Margaret. You just didn't know it yet." A gentle laugh rippled through the room. Margaret laughed too. A real full laugh that came from her chest, not her pride. "Then let's eat, before this turkey turns into history," she said, wiping her tears and clinking her glass. As the night unfolded, stories flowed. They talked about George, the way he used to hum while fixing the fence, his corny jokes at dinner, his unshakable belief in second chances. Even Margaret found herself remembering the good without bitterness. Grace leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, smiling softly as she watched Margaret tell stories. The woman who once looked down her nose at everyone now laughed freely, eyes glowing with peace. Later, when everyone left and the house grew quiet again, Grace helped Margaret clear the table. "You've changed a lot," Grace said. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "No, dear, I finally started living." Grace tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I spent most of my life trying to be respected, but now I just want to be remembered kindly." Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. "You already are." After Grace and Ethan left that night, Margaret stepped onto the porch, the cool November wind brushing against her skin. The stars above Charleston shimmered like 1,000 tiny promises. She looked up and whispered, "George, our boy's happy. You'd be proud, and so am I." For the first time in years, her heart felt light, not because life was perfect, but because it was real. Inside, on the mantel, the framed photo of George seemed to smile in the flickering light. Next to it, Margaret placed a new picture. One of her, Ethan, and Grace taken earlier that day. 3 people who had finally learned that love doesn't always come easy, but it always finds a way. Do you believe people like Margaret can truly change, or does age make the heart harder to move? Comment your thoughts below. Can love and kindness really rewrite someone's story?